Good evening, everybody, and selamat datang. Let me begin by first of all acknowledging that we're standing on the land of the Wurundjeri people who have been custodians of this area for thousands of years. My name is Lindsey from the Centre of Indonesian Law, Islam and Society. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our election post-mortem, what really happened. Tonight's event is presented by the Centre for Indonesian Law, Islam and Society in conjunction with the Electoral Regulation Research Network in the Melbourne Law School and supported by Election Watch in the Melbourne School of Government. And if you haven't looked at the Election Watch Indonesia page, make sure you do very soon because this event is being filmed tonight and it will be available the next day or so on that website. Last Wednesday, with 230,000 candidates contesting 20,893 seats, Indonesia conducted its legislative elections right across the country from district up provincial to the national level.
Could you raise the volume?
Oh, there's no mic, so I'll speak more loudly. How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's
okay. Good. The outcome of the elections, some aspects were not surprising. For example, the negative voter response to the corruption scandals that have plagued Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's Democrat Party. Other outcomes were, however, much more surprising. For example, the famous Jokowi effect failed to materialise for his party, PDIP. Question now is how that will play out in the presidential elections scheduled for 9th of July. Tonight we're going to look at the election in detail and in particular what were the factors that led to the results. What do they mean for the Indonesian legislature for the next 5 years, which will continue to be fragmented as it has been over the last 10. In fact, possibly more fragmented still. What will that mean for the new government, the new administration that's elected on the 9th of July, which yet again will lead a minority government. And what does that in turn mean for the next 5 years of governance in Indonesia generally and for hopes of reform? We have three distinguished presenters with us here tonight and one not here tonight but speaking to us by Skype. Dr. Dirk Tomsa, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Trobe University. Dr. Vanessa Heerman, Lecturer in Indonesian Studies in the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney. Professor Thomas Reuter, ARC Future Fellow in the Asia Institute here at this university. And coming to us originally from Surabaya, but he hopped on a plane to Singapore, so now from Singapore, Dr. Dave McRae, probably best known to many from the Lowy Institute, but now a Senior Research Fellow in the Asia Institute here at this university. So, can I, this being an Indonesian event, ask that everybody make sure their mobile phones are on silent at this point. Our format tonight will be that our speakers will have about 15 minutes each to present. After their presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience. I think we should now get started without further ado, and let me begin just by introducing our first speaker in more detail. Dr. Dirk Tomsa, as I said, is Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science. He gained his Masters from the University of Munster. His PhD from this university dealt with party institutionalisation in Indonesia, with special focus on the party Golkar. His main research areas include politics and society, democratisation studies, and political Islam in Asia. He's currently working on an ARC-funded research project about the nexus between democratisation and conflict management in eastern Indonesia. So Dirk is ideally qualified to speak to us tonight about the outcome of the election and explaining the detail of the results. Can you please make him welcome?
Yeah, with 50 minutes, that's very little time to explain an election result that, as Tim said, surprised many. I was watching it online, but many of my friends and colleagues were over in Indonesia on election day, and once the first quick counts were out, quite a few of us exchanged messages through Facebook and emails, wondering which part of the result was the most surprising. So in my brief talk, I just, for those of you who may not have followed it in great detail, I just update you briefly on the quick count results as they stand at the moment. The results have not been officially confirmed yet by the Election Commission, but quick counts can be taken as relatively accurate. And then focus on two major, perhaps, surprises, namely what Tim said, the Jokowi effect, and why it didn't happen. And what is here, other parties focus on why so many of these medium-sized parties who had been in decline for the last two consecutive elections were actually able to gain some votes and apparently capitalize on the failure of the Jokowi effect to materialize. And then just very briefly in the end, and I think we'll leave that mostly to the Q&A afterwards, some lessons and implications of the results, and I know that Dave in the end will also speak about the view towards the presidential election towards the end. Okay, so there were 5 research institutes in Jakarta who published their quick count results shortly after the polling booths had closed. This is just one of them from Compass, and what immediately becomes clear is the amazingly even spread in the results. That several medium-sized parties that, as I said, had been on the in consistent decline actually, and had been predicted in previous polls to lose further votes, actually gained some votes and were sort of balancing each other out. There's only 3 parties now with more than 10%. The biggest party is PDIP. It did win, but it did not win by the kind of margin that had been predicted in the polls before. So I'll be talking a little bit about PDIP, why it didn't get the 27% that they themselves had aimed for, but certainly also not the 35, 40% that some polls had mentioned was possible due to the candidature of Jokowi. And then I talk a little bit some of these smaller medium-sized parties, why some of them were able to gain votes, why basically none of these parties was apparently at risk of falling under the threshold of 3.5%, which would have disqualified them from entering parliament. There's only 2 on the far right side, the PBB and the PKPI, who didn't make the threshold, and I will not talk in any great detail about them. They were late additions to the election anyway. They've been disqualified by the KPU initially. They then eventually they appealed to that to the Constitutional Court and were allowed, but it didn't really help them much. So let's have a quick look at PDIP's result first. Anyone who was reading or writing about the election before polling day was just fixated basically on this man. Before he was nominated, the question was, would he be nominated before the parliamentary election? Everyone knew that he was the favorite for the presidential election, but for those of you not totally in tune with the electoral system, this was now only the parliamentary election. The presidential election will be in July, and parties needed 25% of the votes or 20% of the seats in parliament in order to nominate a candidate for that presidential election in July. So all the polls said he's the favorite, and everyone was saying if PDIP nominates him before the parliamentary election so that everyone knows, okay, there's not going to be another Megawati attempt, everyone knows, okay, it's going to be Jokowi, then voters will be swayed into voting for PDIP in masses because they would want this man to be president. There were precedents for this kind of rational thinking with Yudhoyono, of course, before, who founded his Democratic Party ahead of the 2004 election. No one knew that party before. The party got into parliament out of nothing, only by voters who wanted Yudhoyono to become president. And same thing again in 2009 when he was the incumbent. His party got 20%, even though his party was still as weakly institutionalized as ever. But people who wanted Yudhoyono to have another turn, they voted for him. They voted for the party, and they got 20%. So there was significant rise in votes just on this factor of the presidential candidate. So PDIP was obviously banking on this, and they did nominate Jokowi just before the start of the official campaign. And as it turned out, now in hindsight, this was actually probably a mistake. They should have done it much earlier, or they may not have needed to do it at all, to keep other options open. Everyone knew that he is the favorite, but if you wanted to bank on him, then you needed, or PDIP would have needed to center its campaign much more clearly on him. Just a day or 2 days before the actual campaign start, there was no time to devise a campaign strategy, to pour resources into ads, into making this man travel all over the country. So it came at the very last minute, and as it turned out, this was actually a bad idea. Clearly, this could not have been predicted before. Even some of my colleagues were saying before, they just need to announce this shortly before the election, and it will help them. But it didn't, and the reason why it didn't was, as I said, there was no time to sort of rejig the campaign accordingly, but also because voters apparently, and this is what I mean by electoral system and voting behavior, voters apparently didn't actually vote as strictly in line with presidential preferences as it was believed to be, as it was anticipated. The electoral system that is used for the parliamentary election is a very candidate-centered system. It's an open list proportional representation system. So when you get your ballot papers, you get the party symbol, but you also get all the candidates listed by name. And you can select the candidate that you want, and the candidate with the most votes, if the party wins a seat there, then the candidate with the most votes will get into parliament. So the entire campaign, long before Jokowi was nominated, was run by all these candidates on the ground, years in advance. They had been out and about in their constituencies trying to mobilize networks, trying to win votes. So by the time Jokowi was announced, these candidates already had set up their so-called team success, their supporters who were trying to shore up votes through clientelistic networks, through religious and mass organizations, etc., etc. And they were basically campaigning on delivering resources to their constituency if they get elected. We can call that pork barrel deals, or we can call it by other names, patronage provision, but this is what was often the main gist of the campaign of these candidates. And these candidates did not really emphasize their party affiliations or the potential presidential candidates. Now, this pattern of campaigning was already visible in 2009 when this electoral system was used for the first time, but back then it had only been introduced very shortly before the election, after a rule by the Constitutional Court. Now the effects were very clearly visible. Candidates knew how to deal with this. They knew they had to basically sell themselves, not the party, not the presidential candidate, and voters responded to that. Voters apparently voted for candidates, not for national broad politics or party identities. So that was an interesting lesson to learn for PDIP, but also for many observers who had not really predicted that, who thought that the effect of the national leaders would trump the concerns of local constituencies. And the final point is the mass media. As some of you may know, just very briefly, most of the media outlets in Indonesia are owned by politically ambitious individuals. The Golkar chairman, Abu Rizal Bakri, owns TV stations. The Partai Nasdem chairman owns the Metro channel. So in the mass media, you saw a relatively concerted attack in the last couple of weeks, not outright really bad, but clearly of trying to damage the reputation of Jokowi by highlighting that he was abandoning his job in Jakarta. He's currently the governor of Jakarta there, had only been elected in 2012. So people were saying, look, he can't really be trusted. He's only just put in place some programs. They haven't even really worked very well so far. So there was a bit perhaps of an effect through the mass media. There were very strong ad campaigns from Jokowi's rivals. But I would say of those various factors, the most important one was the effect of the electoral system, which was clearly underestimated by PDIP and by many observers. Okay, so that was one surprise, that PDIP didn't get anywhere near the result that many hoped for. So amongst the other parties that did mostly better than expected, I divided them into two broad groups. One are the so-called presidential parties. What I mean by that is parties with no particular program, platform, ideology, organizational infrastructure, parties that are basically only there to lift their chairman or their leader into the presidential office. Yudhoyono's Partai Demokrat was the archetype of this in 2004 and 2009. And this party, of course, ran again, but everyone knew that Yudhoyono is no longer eligible for another term. So predictably, they would have lost votes almost certainly anyway. But in addition to that, we know, most of you know, Yudhoyono's second term was rather lackluster. He got a lot of criticism for his lack of engagement, for his aloofness. So his reputation, his popularity had been declining anyway. Then there were the corruption scandals in which various legislators of Partai Demokrat were involved. So Partai Demokrat lost about 10%. And it could very well have been that PDIP would have been the party to pick up on that. And to some extent they were. PDIP did still gain 5% as compared to their previous election in 2009, but not as much as it was believed. The other big winners were Gerindra, the party of Prabowo Subianto, who is the sort of second favorite for the presidential election, of course. Controversial figure, I assume Vanessa will probably talk about him a bit. And Nasdem is the party of Surya Paloh, won 6%, didn't run in 2004-2009. That was probably also not expected, but they had been campaigning reasonably well at the grassroots, trying to present themselves as the only new party. So for appealing to people who wanted reform or wanted something really new, and that apparently worked surprisingly well. Hanura is the party of former General Wiranto, had only just scraped into parliament in 2009. Many people predicted it would not make it again, but they were boosted by the entry of one of the media moguls and oligarchs, Haritanu, and he apparently poured a lot of money into the campaign, which helped Hanura to just survive. They still only got 5%, so they're amongst the smallest, but still better than many had expected. So what all these parties had in common was a party leader that dominates the party image clearly. They could claim that they are new. In the case of Nasdem, Hanura and Gerindra could also claim that they were opposition parties. That's a contentious term in Indonesia because most parties want to be part of the government all the time. But PDIP, Gerindra, and Hanura were the three parties that in the previous term were not actually part of the government coalition. There were 6 parties in the government coalition, 3 were not in there, and Hanura and Gerindra were 2 of them, so they were sort of campaigning a little bit on that they had been consistent opposing the government. And yeah, they had lots of money, and especially through their media outlets, they ran apparently relatively effective media campaigns. Okay, and then the other surprise perhaps, we had the presidential parties, and then we have this bunch of what is usually termed the Islamic parties. Big debate, of course, in the discourse about Indonesian politics, how Islamic they really are. Some perhaps more than others. Clearly, they've all moved to some extent to the center, and none of them is campaigning for an Islamic state anymore. But they have a relatively distinct Islamic outlook, appealing sort of on Islamic identity and symbols to some extent. So there's 4 of them. The PKB and PAN are the 2 parties that are affiliated with mass organizations in Indonesia. And then there's the PKS, which until 2009 had been a bit of the sort of the hope for the devout and pious Muslims because of their, until then, relatively clean track record. So PKS, perhaps I start with that, was a big surprise because their image had basically been shattered due to corruption scandals in the last few years. There were also other issues. There was a legislator caught watching pornography in parliament, which was a bit bad for the image of a devout Islamic party. So that clearly suffered in the media. And the polls before the election were saying that they may only get about 3%. But as it turned out, their base, their grassroots support, which they had been building up between 1999 and 2009, was apparently quite committed to the party, more committed than people had expected. They thought that because the top leadership was so rotten, that voters would actually abandon them. Some did, but not as many as it was believed would happen. So apparently this party building, PKS often described as perhaps the only party with a solid organizational infrastructure, this party base was apparently more loyal than expected. PKB benefited from local dynamics in East Java, where it had long been affiliated with the Islamic mass organization Nahdlatul Ulama. But in the past, there were always splits within PKB, and Nahdlatul Ulama was never solid in actually supporting the parties. So different KIs were recommending different parties or different legislators. That has changed a bit in the last few years. PKB was relatively close to NU in the run-up to the election, and people who were arguing that voters don't respond anymore to recommendations from KI, etc. They are probably now reconsidering that argument too. Apparently there was still some sort of influence, at least, from NU towards voters voting for PKB. There was also, I think, some good recruitment at the grassroots. Again, the effect of the electoral system. These parties knew that they had to get some people, some good candidates who could actually appeal to voters, and apparently, especially P3 and PKB, also PAN, they organized some good campaigns there at the grassroots. I put dissatisfaction with secular corruption with a question mark, given that especially PKS was actually involved in a corruption scandal. I don't quite buy that argument, but a few people have put that forward, saying that secular parties can't be trusted. There were so many corruption scandals involving Partai Demokrat and Golkar, but PKS as well, so I'm not so sure if that actually mattered that much. And then, not fitting any of the sort of categories very well, there's Golkar. As Tim said, I wrote my PhD about Golkar, and it sort of keeps haunting me. I was recently asked again to comment on Golkar's performance, even though I haven't actually worked on them closely for a while now. And in my thesis, I was actually quoting a former Golkar member who told me back in 2004 that Golkar is like a zombie. You often think it's dead, but whenever you think it's dead, it's actually still alive and it comes back. And Golkar was just, depending on your interpretation, either stagnant or stable. It achieved more or less the same result as in 2009. They had the same problems, no charismatic leader who could sort of put their face up on the map, but at the same time, still a network of reasonably committed, well-experienced, well-connected grassroots cadres, which helped them sort of get the votes in, especially in eastern Indonesia, as far as I can tell. I haven't looked at the spread of the votes in detail yet, but in previous elections, they always got the bulk of their votes in eastern Indonesia. And we'll talk about the future implications shortly, but let me predict that Golkar will probably be part of the government again, as ever. So I got the 2-minute call. So what do we learn from this? The impact of institutions, something that interests me as a political scientist in particular, was apparently quite strongly at play at this election. Institutions shape how parties are conducting their campaign. In this case, how candidates are conducting their campaign. And they provide incentives for voters to respond to these campaigns. And this was quite clearly at play here. Indonesia is moving ever more increasingly away from a party-centered system to a candidate-centered system. There have been reforms to the electoral system almost for every election. This one was now run on the same system as previously, with just a few minor tweaks. If this system remains in place in the future, then we will clearly see the identities and the strengths, there are not many, but there are some, the strengths of political parties further erode. So this was an interesting lesson for everyone to learn. Despite the sort of anticlimactic interpretation of the result, we do need to see that PDIP actually won the election. They didn't win it as well as it was hoped for, but they did win. So we have a new strongest party in parliament, and with Jokowi as presidential candidate, we can hope that there will be some change to the political dynamics afterwards. Okay, I'll finish here and hand over to Vanessa.